Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Q&A about business, innovation, and managing life. I see a few questions that have accumulated here. Let's see. Question here, do you believe it's a good time for biotech entrepreneurial endeavors? Boy, that's complicated. There are different parts of the biotech space. There's discover a drug that's going to become a blockbuster. There's make a medical device. There's create a diagnostic system. I think they all have slightly different issues around them. I mean, find an amazing drug that's never been found before. It's a terribly complicated business. I mean, people have these waves of hope that now we really understand how to discover molecules that are going to do just the right things. And we're in several of those waves of hope right now. But going from I found a molecule that does something really cool to I'm making money selling a drug is a very long, complicated process, usually not achieved by an entrepreneur, so to speak. Usually that happens when a small company gets bought by a bigger company that then spends the $1 billion that it takes to actually get the drug to market and a long period of time. So, there is new hope that there are new ways to find great drugs that will make lots of money one day. Yes, there are such new hopes, and I think that we can talk about some of the different directions that are being taken. People have thought maybe 5 times before that the dam will burst and we'll finally have a great way to sort of discover new kinds of drugs. It hasn't happened before. It might happen now. I think whether that's from people doing kind of rational drug design back in the day, whether that's from people going to explore every corner of the flora and fauna of the earth to find things that have particular characteristics, whether that's invention of various kinds of the monoclonal antibodies, or whether it's some biologic drugs, whether it's now kind of gene editing kinds of approaches and so on. It always turns out, this is the awkward thing about biomedicine, is that it's always more complicated than you can possibly imagine. It's always, I think I've understood this a little bit in recent times from a theoretical point of view of how it comes to be that biological systems just have this sort of immense kind of layer of computational irreducibility, immense layer of complexity of sort of arbitrary features that you have to kind of dig through and hope that you'll get far enough through it to be able to make something that works for at least a large swath of patients and so on. I think that that's on the side of kind of making drug-like things. I think, sort of another piece is the whole sort of stem cell, create, artificial organs, kind of find ways to have, replenish your mitochondria, inject new healthy cells and so on. There are lots of things going on in those areas right now that seem quite promising. What it will look like in terms of things like regulatory approval, I don't know. But those certainly seem like they're, technologies have gotten to the point, whether it's 3D printing technologies, whether it's stem cell technologies, whether it's kind of outside bioreactors being able to multiply cells, all those kinds of things. They do seem to be sort of bubbling to the point where exciting things are possible. I think on the side of kind of diagnostics and so on, again, there's a lot of stuff that seems to be kind of bubbling, whether it's, you take this blood sample and you can immediately tell lots of things about, tumors developing or metabolic things happening, all those kinds of things. I mean, the thing that will really break that dam is if and when there's a non-invasive kind of way of just measuring, perhaps using Raman spectroscopy or something like this, measuring levels of all kinds of different things in one's blood, there'll be a kind of an amazing sort of collection of diagnostic things that become possible when you can kind of continuously measure, oh, I just ate that piece of chocolate, this is what it did, beyond the somewhat invasive, continuous glucose monitors, which are monitoring just one substance, being able to do that across many substances. No doubt there are lots of things that one can conclude from that. I think as another thing could happen, I know some initiatives along these lines, is a vastly cheaper level of sequencing, gene sequencing, that again will open up a bunch of new possibilities. If you could routinely sequence your genome every day, or sequence or get or routinely take the thing, this thing where you think you might have a cold, and you immediately sequence the genome of whatever critter was infecting you, or you sequence all those kinds of things where that becomes sort of commonplace and really cheap. That really opens up a bunch of other possibilities. I mean, the issue with biotech is that most of what one is ultimately delivering is heavily regulated, and and therefore there's an irreducible cost to delivering these kinds of things. It gets, as you get less and less invasive, less and less sort of stuff you take, stuff that's in you, so to speak, and more on the kind of giving information. You get, you decrease those costs, and that makes for sort of a quicker and perhaps easier entrepreneurial experience. I mean, I do think that in the biomedical space, there's all sorts of opportunity right now for medical history taking with LLMs, medical diagnosis with LLMs, all these kinds of things. Those seem quite ripe, and perhaps the world has evolved to the point where sort of the regulatory aspects of those have been somewhat taken care of, or at least are not as kind of significant as they were at one point. So a few thoughts along those lines. I mean, I think the other issue with biotech is there's these informational things which are sort of just software, but a lot of biotech involves, experiments. And one of the issues there is, well, how much does it really cost to do a biotech experiment? One of the things that I think is important that's coming there is the concept of cloud labs. I mean, we've been involved for a long time with a company called Emerald Cloud Lab, which is sort of the leading effort in being able to make something where you just type Wolfram language code, and off in some sort of factory-like space, there are actual biology experiments getting done, or chemistry experiments getting done for you. They've managed to automate a couple of hundred different types of experiments and be able to do them reproducibly and so on. Using a cloud lab dramatically reduces the initial cost of sort of setting up a biotech effort. I mean, otherwise, if you have to build your own lab, it's a $5 million, $10 million proposition, and maybe 18 months of time before you really get started. With a cloud lab, you are sort of able to get started with a few $100,000 potentially, and that allows you to do something more quickly, and you don't have to build out the kind of wet lab facilities and so on. And I think that when that really becomes widely used, and I would say that right now, somewhat paradoxically, cloud labs are much more used by big pharma companies than they are by startups. I think that's partly a sort of a weird phenomenon of the funding of biotech startups, which is if you're a founder of a biotech startup, then you want to raise $10 million or whatever it is, sort of to get started. And if you could use a cloud lab and kind of get started for $200,000, there's a great tendency to only raise a few $100,000, which doesn't give you a lot of runway. And it's sort of a dynamic between entrepreneurs and investors and so on. And I think that will get resolved, and it will become clear that you can, you get your $5 to $10 million of initial sort of funding, which gives you a runway and an ability to buy a certain amount of cloud lab services. And you're sort of often running with the same kind of runway, but without the risk of having to build out your own lab. But I think that sort of changes the story a bit for biotech entrepreneurism. It gives you a bit more of a software-like experience than a hardware-like experience. I mean, back at some point in the history of the computer industry, before I was involved in it, if you were going to sort of build out something in the early days of computers, it's like you have to build hardware, which is a very expensive proposition. The idea that you could just layer on software and have that be the thing you were selling, that was a later, so that was something that came, that wasn't the first thing that happened. I mean, companies, IBM, for example, which was the dominant computer company back in the 1960s and so on, even by the 1970s, they really had the point of view that the thing you really sold was the hardware, and you had to sort of invest in the hardware, and the big companies were going to be the hardware companies. So Microsoft came in with its kind of like, that's a complicated history, but of providing software, which at the beginning, IBM just was like, that's like selling the floor mats of cars or something. It's something nobody really cares about. It's a little add-on. We can just have that piece of fluff added to our hardware sale. Of course, that wasn't how the computer industry continued to evolve, and pretty soon there were more profits flowing to companies like Microsoft than going to the hardware makers. But in the biotech space, it's sort of all been about the hardware or explicit experimental level until now. I think cloud labs, when that really takes off and really gets engaged with the startup ecosystem properly, that's going to change that picture. And the concept of kind of a labless biotech startup will become real. I mean, this is something that's happened, for example, in the semiconductor industry. The concept of a fabless semiconductor company, companies like ARM are fabless semiconductor companies, even NVIDIA. They're not companies that are actually building their chips. They're companies that are designing chips, doing the sort of software-ish level of developing chips, and then outsourcing the process of actually manufacturing those things. That hasn't been possible in biotech, really. I mean, there is a mechanism in the biotech business, so-called clinical research organizations, CROs, which are companies that will basically do your research for you. It's sort of research as a service. But that's bundling kind of the actual figuring out the research along with the doing of experiments and so on. What cloud labs enable is the possibility of having you do all the figuring out, you're kind of calling the shots of the research, but the deployment, the kind of hardware level of doing the biotech is being outsourced. And I think that will change things. And I suspect there will be a generation of kind of labless biotech startups that I've sort of been surprised hasn't really really started up yet, but I think it will. Now, one dynamic of that that's always complicated is that in the field of biology, it's one of these fields where to feel like you're really doing things, you have to feel like you're in a lab, pipetting liquids and all this kind of thing. It's a place where it doesn't quite feel like honest work if you're not actually sort of in the lab with your pipettes and so on. And I think that's something that's sort of a feature of the kind of social dynamic of life sciences fields. Probably that will change. And in the same way that most people probably who do software engineering and do things with software have no clue what's inside a computer and how it really works, and wouldn't be able to fix the hardware of their computer, which has become very difficult these days anyway, in any fashion. I mean, I think there came this moment when people who got degrees in even, well, certainly in computer science, but even in EECS, had never used an oscilloscope, hadn't really actually seen those electrical signals, bouncing around and so on, because things had gotten to this layer of much more software-oriented work. And my guess is that's a sort of coming attraction in biotech. But so, yes, I mean, these are exciting times for life sciences. A lot's getting figured out. A lot of sort of the mechanisms of life are getting better and better understood. I think it's almost a bottomless pit of sort of complexity of things that go on in living systems. And that's sort of both a a difficulty and an opportunity. It's an opportunity because they're just all these hacks you can imagine using to do things which are very significant to us medically, so to speak, but which are just like, well, gosh, if you did this, had this particular molecule that blocks this particular thing, has this particular pathway, and this molecule was, occurred in a few fungi that somebody collected, and now we can use it and and apply it to human medicine. That's the kind of thing one expects. I mean, it is a little bit sort of embarrassing at some level that most of the great advances, things like CRISPR, things like nanopore technology for sequencing and so on, CRISPR for gene editing and so on. These are things where the fundamental mechanisms came from biology. They were not engineered mechanisms. Now, and that's something where sort of the current round of hope of AI meets things like drug development is that one will really be able to go at a more sort of pseudo engineering level of you define what you want, and it's almost you're telling text to an LLM and it's spitting out molecular designs which can then be applied. I mean, I think there's sort of an intermediate thing which I don't hear people talk about as much, which is using LLM technology and so on to mine the existing literature and really find molecules and things from the existing literature. That's something that has traditionally been done. I mean, there are endless efforts to go through all the chemical patents and all this kind of thing, find things from that. But I think there's this question of to what extent can one sort of know the structures of molecules and be able to produce molecules with particular characteristics, sort of at the pure LLM level. To what extent are you getting that from literature, etc.? But it is complicated. I think the life cycle of biotech firms has involved rather a lot of money and has been kind of complicated. That might change with cloud labs and might change with more of the kind of diagnostic software level of things being able to be done. Let's see. Susie asks, how does one get funding for a project like a biotech business? Well, there are venture capital firms that fund biotech companies, and they kind of know the rhythm of those things. And it's mostly slightly different companies than the ones that, some overlap, of the ones that fund things like software companies, because there really are different capital requirements at different times and different expectations that one can have, different timescales and so on. I would say that there's a class of venture capital firms, investors. I seem to know lots of them that are like to think of themselves as doing deep tech, of doing things where it's actually hard to make the thing work, and it's often a kind of, gosh, that would be really cool if it worked, but it requires sort of a leap of physics faith or biology faith to believe that it might work, and that's kind of there's a small group of firms that are really into that kind of thing. I think the jury is probably still out on whether that really is a viable investment strategy. I think that most of those deep tech plays are somewhat long term. It just takes a while to develop some whole new sort of direction in technology, and maybe some of them will end up being the huge winners of things that turn into trillion-dollar businesses, and many will not. And I think it's a complicated thing because in general, in venture capital, for example, one has to take sort of a portfolio approach. I mean, I know from my own observing of these things, years and years ago, I used to invest a bit in companies. I stopped doing that in terms of cash investments. I tend to invest time and being an advisor to companies and things like that, rather than investing cash, because I always found it very frustrating, because you would see companies where they really did have good things going for them, and they would make horrible, crazy mistakes and crash and burn. And it was kind of, it was sort of too frustrating for me as an individual, at least, to be investing cash in those things. I think that's really for the professionals, so to speak, to do that and to maintain a big enough portfolio that, yeah, if that one company has a CEO who goes totally bonkers, it's like, okay, whatever, we've got another 100 companies where different things are going to happen. You can really take a more relaxed portfolio approach, which is a more difficult thing to do if you're an individual investor investing in a more modest number of companies. Let's see. Well, a question here from Neil. Do you have advice in relation to learning and thinking, specifically with people with poor working memory? This seems a great impediment to efficiency and context construction in general. I don't know what it's like to have poor working memory, thankfully. I mean, sometimes I feel like I'm I mean, my best suggestion would be, write things down all the time and be looking at what you did. I suppose my partial experience of that would be when I write things, and I tend to have the very bad habit of not rereading. If I start working on something, some evening or something, I'm trying to write something. I just had this experience yesterday, actually. I'm writing something and I've written a piece of it, and then I'm keeping on going. And I kind of have to force myself to reread the stuff I already wrote. Otherwise, I find myself kind of repeating a bunch of things that I already said, which makes for a horrible mess of a piece, so to speak. So in some sense, writing down what you're doing and forcing yourself to reread things. Now, in modern times, there are also all kinds of devices that sort of record what you're saying, record what you're typing. I use, I could imagine that sort of going back and being able to remind oneself by sort of glancing back at the transcript of what one said or whatever would be a useful thing to do. In fact, just today, I have one of these little audio pendant type things, and I was just talking to someone today, mostly about history, and that was my first time out of using this audio recording device that sort of does immediate transcription. I haven't looked at the transcript yet, so I don't really know how it came out. And it was a walk outside, so it may be that it picks it up horribly and can't distinguish the two voices and all kinds of things like that. I don't really know. I mean, years ago, I used to very often have a little clipped on thing that took a picture every, I don't know, 15, 30 seconds or something. Most settings, it was really not neither useful nor socially acceptable. I did find that the case of things like trade shows, it was really useful because I could go back afterwards and I could say, what were the booths that I ran into? Oh, what was that person I talked to? I can read their name tag from the picture I took. But I don't know, in terms of sort of shorter term stuff, it's kind of like if you're recording things and you're able to quickly sort of swipe back and see what happened recently, that's probably a big help in terms of sort of working memory, not having such good working memory. I mean, I would say also that if you're doing things like writing code, increasingly there are ways to kind of to sort of remember what you already have, and to have sort of summaries of what you already have, which I suspect is useful for sort of keeping track of that and being able to move forward. Let's see. Tracy asks, explain first principles thinking and why physicists, engineers, and mathematicians, as well as tech entrepreneurs, find it so important. Have you managed this and succeeded where others have failed? Well, I see that the question involves first principles thinking with capital F, P, and T. I'm not sure I completely know what that is. I think I try to adopt kind of a first principles approach to thinking about things. I have often called it foundational thinking. And yeah, it's really important to kind of, there's always a layer where you're kind of skating on top of things and you kind of roughly understand what's going on, but there are questions you can ask that are sort of foundational questions. And it's kind of, you got to ask those questions. I mean, I was literally just before this, I was in a meeting talking about a new business initiative of ours that I have to say was a bit more fuzzily presented than I would have liked. And they're sort of very basic questions. How much are we going to spend? how do we make that money back? What are the distribution channels for this? What have we done in terms of making deals and so on in those distribution channels? These are sort of obvious questions, and it is sometimes shocking the extent to which people don't ask the obvious questions. I mean, I think one of the things you have to do is you have to have kind of no kind of pride. I will always be asking obvious questions. I suppose I've had enough experience now that occasionally I'll ask an obvious question when people say, "Oh yeah, that's well known," and they're like, "Oh yeah, we already did that. We've got that fully taken care of. It was kind of a stupid question to ask." But that is the unbelievable minority of times when I ask sort of the obvious question. Much more common is you ask the obvious question and people are like, "Oh, that's a good question. I didn't think to ask that question." Even though, if you sort of zoom out and you say, I'm looking at this P&L, profit and loss statement, and there's this line item, and it says, oh, I don't know, one recently, yet again, this happened before, I'm looking at one of these, and there's a line that lists itself as telephone. And it's like, we did not spend that kind of money on telephones. If we did, there's something very, very, very wrong. What is that line? Well, that's sort of an obvious question to ask. If you see a big number for telephone in today's world, it's probably not telephone. It's probably internet connectivity and supporting, network connections for Wolfram Alpha, or who knows what else it is in our case. But it's like you got to ask the obvious question. And, I think that's a thing I think I've probably always been reasonably good at that, but I think I sort of insist on doing that in all situations. Let me take it down to first principles, basically, and ask the obvious question. And that's super useful. Now, I've done that a lot in science as well. But a lot of the cases in business, for example, are in my view, sort of shockingly obvious questions to ask, which people have a terrible habit of sort of floating on the top and not asking those questions. As I say, it requires a certain confidence to just ask the obvious questions, because you might be worried, oh, people are going to think like think I'm dumb to be asking such an obvious question. That is exactly the opposite of my experience. People so often, you ask the obvious question, they're like, oh my gosh, we should have answered that question, but we didn't. They're kind of the ones who feel a bit dumb for not asking that question, not the person who kind of formulates the obvious question. But to me, when you're trying to figure things out and so on, you've got to sort of drill down until you're on bedrock, because otherwise, if you start building things up and it's like, well, I'm working out all these things and we could solve this problem and we could do this and that and the other, and it's like, but actually it makes no sense, because we could build this wonderful piece of technology, but turns out, oh, it doesn't run. I'm going to make it up. I mean, we build. Well, actually, yes. I'll give you an example from something just yesterday. A piece of technology that allows us to have local versions of a bunch of natural language understanding technology that we've long run in the cloud. And the question is, okay. So first question is, how realistic is it to run it locally? It's not useful if it only runs on the very biggest computers that nobody has. And then if we could run it locally, what would it actually do there? And does it have a way to dovetail with the things that we're already doing there? Or is it something where it's going to be able to do a little bit, but then it's going to have to kind of ask out to the cloud anyway? And so what advantage does it have? But there's sort of obvious questions there where it's where in fact in that particular case, I would say that project probably got a little bit too far along without, in that case, re-asking some of the obvious questions about what was really being done and what we could really get out of it. But and that's something, what can happen with projects is they start off sort of with the best of directions and so on, but then it turns out as you get further into them, they didn't evolve as you expected, and you don't go back to ask the basic questions again, and that's always a mistake. I mean, again, it takes people, when they're in the middle of the project, they're like, we're just doing our thing. And it doesn't, they don't end up sort of going back and saying, let's ask the foundational questions. That happens all the time in science, that people will be, there'll be 3 academic generations on from the originators of a particular field. There'll be hundreds of thousands of papers on from the launching papers of that field, and they will be kind of just sort of floating on that level of kind of structure that's been built. And it may very well turn out to be the case that some of the foundational assumptions weren't right. And that only became clear when a lot had been built on them. But people don't go back and ask those questions. And in fact, I would say that I've had a lot of success in science as well as in technology in kind of going back and asking sort of the obvious questions, sort of even when people had sort of imagined that all those foundations were in the past and never had to be re-examined. Let's see. Jamie asks, how do you ask a good question? How, Jamie asks, can I get better at doing that? I think depends on what kind of area. I mean, how do you know that? How could you possibly know that? Those are all good questions to start asking when people tell you this is a thing. It's like, well, why is it a thing? And, how did you figure out that that was a thing? And, there's usually, there's both intellectually and historically sort of a tower that gets built for anything. Intellectually, it's kind of going back to sort of the foundational assumptions of what you're doing. Historically, it's like, how did people come to believe that? Both of those things are very useful to understand. They may be related, they may not. People may come to understand very foundational things by incredibly circuitous routes that are floating on top of all sorts of stuff. But then eventually it becomes clear that this really is showing you a way to something quite foundational. I mean, I think it's like, I think the questions have to do with just get to the point where the thing you're understanding is so obvious, it's so built on such obvious, well-known things that you really can know that it's a sort of solid tower that you built from the bedrock to the thing that you're now talking about. And people are surprisingly reluctant to do that. I mean, I think it's sort of it feels too simplistic. It feels like, oh, somebody must have already done this. It must be a waste of time to do this, but it's not. Sort of bringing that kind of clarity to things, I have found to be just incredibly valuable. And it's really, can you ask questions to get you to the point where you can be absolutely sure of what it is that you think you're figuring out, because it is based on things that are so well known to you and other people that there's sort of no doubt about them, and where the sort of things that are built on top of that are kind of so sort of simple-mindedly following from each other that you can that you can do that. And I think the times when I was when I make mistakes, it's usually because I jumped over something. I didn't really understand all those steps that it took to get to where I was getting to. It helps a lot when one's using sort of computation. And, I like to think that our computational language, Wolfram language, is I think it's sort of the best way we've managed to construct in the world so far to sort of take a broad range of kinds of thoughts and put them in a concrete form that, by the way, our computers can also help us work out, but in a form where we're really explaining ourselves in a precise way, and we're able to sort of know that we have all those bricks in place. I mean, I find incredibly often I sort of think I more or less understand something, and it's like, well, let me implement that. And then I realized, well, actually, there were some pieces I didn't really understand very well. And there's effort in actually getting it into that precise form so I can implement it. And then once I've implemented it, I've got a sort of streamlined version of the thing I was thinking about. that helps me in thinking about it further. But then I can build from there, and I can get the computer to sort of help me do things. And pretty soon I'm off zooming, discovering all kinds of things I never knew were the case. And the computer is sort of feeding me lots of new information. So I find that really useful. Let's see. Um, let's see. La Petite asks, how is the value of a degree going to change in the next 5 years? To the best of your knowledge, and tea leaves and crystal balls and all that kind of thing. That's an interesting question about degrees and universities and so on. Um, I think it relates a bit also to the structure of jobs and so on. And, the extent to which people have a single job versus multiple gig kinds of things versus a job and many gigs. I think that an awful lot of kind of gig-like activities are not sort of degree-oriented activities. Maybe that's not entirely correct, but there are a lot of things where it's like, if you can do X, write a piece of code to do this, do a piece of graphic design that does that, drive somebody from here to there in this way, those kinds of things. Those are not really, those are like, have you done it before? And, oh, if you've done it before and people liked what you did, okay, great, you're off and running, you can do it again. If you're going to be a successful blogger, influencer, live streamer, whatever, I don't think anybody knows or cares what degree you have. I mean, there are what one might think of as quite sort of regulated industries. You're going to be a doctor, a lawyer, financial person of various kinds, of some kinds. I mean, there are many financial things that are not regulated in this way, but there are others that are, a broker or something like this, where, well, again, that's not really a degree-based thing either. A realtor, it's not a degree-based thing. It's like you do a test, you get certified, but it's like, I don't think anybody asks you, when you go to get your realtor license, I don't think anybody's asking you, did you get a degree in this or that? It happens that, to be a lawyer, I think you have to have a degree. To be a doctor, you certainly have to have a degree. To be a professor, you have to have a fancy degree, typically. But these are kind of places where those are sort of degrees are a thing. I mean, if you are asking about software engineering, for example, or wrangling LLMs or whatever, it shouldn't be the case that anybody cares if you have a degree, or if you're doing DevOps or computer security. There are some certifications that are useful, and particularly in computer security, but in many of those fields, it's like, can you do the job? If you can do the job, great. And there's evidence you can do the job. That's what's important. It's not, did you go through this program where you sort of got this degree from the university? So, it's sort of a question of how those things evolve. I would say, for example, in software engineering, I know at our company, we've hired people at all stages, from sort of high school level through people with PhDs and professoring experience and so on. And, our question is pretty simple. Can you write great production quality code? If the answer is yes, it makes no difference whether, your final degree was, your second year in high school or something. Your final education was your second year in high school, or whether you, got a PhD and were a professor or something. Doesn't make any difference. What matters is the ability to produce that high quality output. And so, I think that the value. So there are different kinds of degrees, different kinds of schools. I would say that there's a certain, well, let's see, there's several things to point out. I mean, my feeling is that in the near future, the value of broad education will greatly exceed the value of specialized education. There has been a trend for probably nearly half a century to go into to get educated about more and more specialized things, to get to be the expert in this very specific area. and to be trained up for a decade in this particular thing. I think as more and more gets successfully automated, that becomes less and less important. And what becomes more important is kind of the strategy of what you actually want to do. Then you can set your machine off to do the thing and to do all that specialized work. And you get to be the one calling the shots. And knowing how to call the shots is something that typically needs breadth, not depth. I mean, you need a certain amount of depth to understand these different areas, but it's more important to kind of not be blindsided. It's more important, and this comes back to sort of the foundational thinking kind of direction, to be able to do foundational thinking and to know enough in a bunch of different areas that you can successfully ask the right questions and so on, rather than to know some very particular area in incredible detail and be able to be specialized in that particular thing. So I tend to think that the value of kind of liberal arts education, education in areas like philosophy and so on, is going to increase, and the value of extremely specialized education is not in the coming years. And when you look at kind of universities, well, there are all kinds of issues with universities. I mean, it doesn't help that the mission of universities got slightly split into, is it the preservation of existing knowledge? Is it the creation of new knowledge through research? Is it kind of serving a role in society that involves some kinds of societal objectives and so on? Which of those objectives is one picking for the university? And they have somewhat different kind of machinery that needs to be run to have them work. I mean, in other words, and I think universities, and it's sort of being forced in the US by some pressure from the government, are being forced a bit to choose about those objectives. Is it preservation of knowledge? Is it creation of new knowledge? Is it sort of social position, social sort of structure, or social sort of doing things for society, so to speak? And I think different universities, my guess is some different universities will somewhat diverge in that respect, more so than they perhaps have done in the past, and at least in the recent past. I think that so in terms of what so another role that universities have played, particularly in the US, is sort of they are a place where you go to become an adult type thing. Although somehow they've been gradually sort of backsliding on that, and more kind of expecting to, both students and parents are expecting more and more kind of treat them like kids type thing for the college students. That's one thing. The other thing is, particularly at the more elite universities, there's a build my social network for, and it's true also for regional universities actually, but build my social network going forward. It's less clear at regional universities because people have often sort of been in high school or sort of high school-like activities around the same people. At the elite universities, part of the story ends up being, build your personal network for the future. And in a sense, by saying I've got a degree from place X, it's, oh, well, you're connected into this or that social network. Now, those social networks are important, again, for some kinds of jobs and not for others. I mean, if you're going to be somebody who is doing independent, trading or something like this, it doesn't really matter whether you have a social network. It's a question of whether, the trades you make do well and you do well from it or not. And you can be sitting by yourself in the middle of nowhere doing that. If you want to go work for a particular kind of bank or hedge fund or law firm or whatever else, there's often a very strong social network component where it's kind of like, oh, yes, the person who knows the person who did this and so on. And that networking mechanism, I would say, is, it feels very exclusionary, and it is at some level, but it's also, from the point of view of companies, it can work quite well because people are sort of pre-enculturated. You know what you're getting into, the people who are there, they know, it's sort of a chain of cultural connection, so to speak. Does that feel unfair to people who have not sort of signed on to that whole thing? At some level, it is, and but from the point of view of the company sort of trying to build their team, it makes good sense. I tend to think that there are so this question of having a degree from place X that kind of shows you're part of that social club can be useful for some kinds of jobs, and it's completely irrelevant for other jobs. I mean, I myself had the interesting experience. I grew up in England. I went to the sort of top schools there for kind of slightly randomly, but I ended up doing so. And my social network in the UK will be great. I know the people who are, I was in school with the people who are running things in the government and the banks and the this and the that and the other. I've made essentially no use of that whatsoever in my life because I moved to the US. It's a completely different group of people and sort of almost essentially no crossover. So I've kind of seen what that network looks like and personally made no use of it. And it's and I think, well, sometimes but so that's one reason for sort of if one's a little bit cynical but realistic, that's one reason for sort of the degree type thing in is that. Another thing is if you're going into one of these areas that kind of where everybody wants the doctor to have a certain amount of actual knowledge that they could certify they have based on having got a degree at a university. If you're going to be an entrepreneur, getting a degree, who knows? I mean, it seems, it really is, it's irrelevant to being an entrepreneur. And I do know of a kid uh, who recently uh, got uh, got into Harvard and was going to go be a student at Harvard, but was decided to start a company, and they they showed up at Harvard for 2 weeks and probably lost their deposit as a result of it only being 2 weeks and so on, just because they really wanted to have on their resume that they dropped out of Harvard, even though they were, and that was almost better than a degree. That was seen as being sort of entrepreneurially cooler than getting a degree. I went there, I joined the club, so to speak, but then I dropped out and went off to be an entrepreneur. It does amuse me that, for example, Y Combinator, one of the tech incubators started by Paul Graham, I actually saw it from the very beginning. But it's become a sort of a big thing. But people will kind of quote themselves as YC and then the year, and that's kind of like saying University X class of such and such year. I mean, I think that and it is interesting to me to see that the YC qualifications for many people are much more significant than, oh, I graduated from Stanford or something like this. So it's a complicated landscape, and I think my own sort of general, if you have a path to go that's like, I'm going to start a company, I'm going to do this, that, or the other thing. Oops. go wrong here. Um, hold on. I just messed something up. Oh, okay. Did we just fix this? Or yeah, okay. Um, don't know how that happened. Anyway, should be back. Um, the anyway, um, let's see. Kathy asks, do you think there will be AI-led universities where AIs create and implement the curriculum, maybe even teach? Well, we're in the process of building an AI-based tutor. It's a difficult project. The idea that you can get something that sort of will autonomously engage folks in learning things without sort of a human there it's not clear how well that's going to work. I mean, there's a lot of years of failure. We have been making an effort last year and a bit to build a very specific thing, a tutor for Algebra 1. Um, and in fact, just in the last few weeks, we've been starting to test it on actual kids. And I think the first measure is what's the attention span of kids interacting with this. And I will say that I just was hearing yesterday from, it so happens that a couple of people who are working on this particular product have kids who are in the demographic, so to speak, to be using the product. And their reports of the attention spans were not yet impressive. Um, so it's unclear how that will play out. I mean, my feeling is that will eventually work. AIs will eventually learn, and the things we're trying to build will eventually give one a way to have the AI sort of learn enough about the human to be able to feed knowledge to the human in a way that's well optimized for the human, and to kind of keep the sort of the process of learning chugging along. Whether one can get the same kind of I'm convinced to learn because I'm trying to relate to some particular human, I'm not sure. Um, in terms of um, you know AIs and their relationship to universities, I mean, I think AI is a very useful kind of adjunct tool to lots of kinds of learning, whether it's the kind of sort of old style AI that we've built for years in Mathematica and Wolfram Alpha and things like this, whether it's the LLM style kind of more sort of less precise kind of more kind of human-like sort of linguistic AI kinds of things. I mean, there clearly are use cases. If you're supposed to be revising for some test, and you can have the AI see what you were supposed to be learning and ask you questions about it. That's clearly a useful use case. And there are lots of, talk to the textbook type use cases that seem to be quite good, and which we're doing things to support actually. But I don't know the extent to which. Okay, so an interesting question is, if you look at sort of the what's inside a university, a modern university, there's actual professors doing teaching, there's people managing the facilities, things like this, and then there's a layer of complex bureaucratic structure within universities. And I would have the suspicion that a lot of that can be AI-ified usefully. All of these, do I have permission to take this class with this thing and that thing and the other thing? Those are the kinds of sort of weak, light judgment calls and things that I would think are ripe for kind of AI automation. I don't know to what extent people are really trying to do that, because I think what's tended to happen at universities, and this is one of their problems right now, is this kind of these layers of administrative structure that they built. And it's always a challenge to remove layers of administrative structure. It seems to be sort of a constant of history that bureaucracy always increases until there's some really big shock to the system that sort of makes the whole thing get rebuilt without that bureaucracy. So I don't know how that will play out, but that would seem to me to be an area potentially ripe for the sort of AIification of universities. Um, let's see. Uh, um, Um, well, actually, coming back to this question about degrees, and it's sort of a question of, is it worth it? Is it worth it to spend the time, to spend the money, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And I think it really depends on what the end point is supposed to be. I mean, it is a terrible fact that a tiny minority of people who go to college go there to just kind of just for the purpose of learning. It usually is, oh, because I want to get this particular credential to go on in this particular direction, or, oh, I want to get out of where I was before. I want to sort of see the world type thing. I want to, have a social time, those kinds of things. The fraction of people who are going to college just to kind of learn interesting stuff is rather small. That's always struck me as a shame because in the past, when college was a much smaller business, that was the main reason people went to college. And even when I was a kid in England, um, you know, of the not everybody who went to a fancy school went to college. They would go straight into various kinds of jobs, and sometimes to various kinds of family businesses, sometimes to other kinds of things, but sometimes to the military, those kinds of places. But college wasn't really necessarily on the agenda. It was only for people who wanted to learn stuff that they would go to college. And I think, that's the thing when you ask what's the value of a degree, if you think that it will be an enriching thing in your life to learn stuff, then college is a good place to learn stuff. Not the only place to learn stuff, but a good place to learn stuff. I think one of the things that is an interesting question, what's going to happen with it, is companies that, like one software company just a couple of weeks ago made a bit of a splash by announcing, well, they're just trying to get very bright high school students and they're going to sort of bring them in and train them up. And yeah, that's going to work, I'm sure. For professions like software engineering, that will work. For an individual, this question of, you might lead a more interesting life and a more productive life if you've learned a bunch of broad things, and you can do that by going to college. That's a good thing for the individual. It's a different thing if you go to college to do this incredibly narrow set of things. I mean, if that's what you really want to do, if you want to be a math professor, for example, you're going to have to learn that whole tower of knowledge that's in math, and you're going to go to college and go to graduate school and so on and do that. And that is the path you have to follow if you want to get to that end point. But it's, if you want to be an entrepreneur, I don't think there's a path there. And by the time you're sort of going to college about entrepreneurism, I kind of think much is lost. I think that sort of the let's teach people to be sort of the kind of the very well structured way to do things that are fundamentally not well structured is sort of a strange concept. Let's see. Jamie is asking, given the shift with remote working for companies, do you see a potential market for secure networked home office labs that have several layers of security considerations? The Faraday cage, the heating controls, the infrared protection against drones. These would be modular and easy to install. Boy, if we live in a society where you really have to worry about sort of living in this fully militarized kind of box to do your work, that's a society that is, one hopes one isn't living in, so to speak. I mean, there are, of course, parts of the world which are in the middle of wars right now, and where that's the kind of thing one would have to imagine doing. But I don't see, in terms of kind of it's an interesting question whether uh, um, whether the to what extent sort of the home office setup is it all secure? I mean, I think it's something where I have to admit I have not done this very often. I recently, for really stupid reasons, I ended up doing a call to some bank for something that was, I obviously went to some home office person which it shouldn't have done, given what it was. And a home office person, no doubt offshore. And the, it did give me some pause of, should I even be doing this call? Given that I know this is not a secure setting and so on. And so there are situations which I can imagine where people should worry about, is the person they're talking to about some fraud protection thing, or is the person they're talking to about some medical thing or whatever, where actually are they? Are they in the middle of their living room with a bunch of other people around, or are they somewhere which is sort of sequestered away? I mean, I know in when one's doing sort of monitoring of sort of secured kind of computer systems, there's a question of where are the people who are doing that monitoring, and where we do a certain amount of that stuff, and it's like you have to be in some area that has some degree of physical security. So I guess I can see that, do I have this special place in my house where I go to do the secure stuff? I can imagine that being a thing, actually. I mean, it's not the dominant part of the work from home market, but there probably is a corner of the market where that is a thing, and where probably, if one was to look into what's been done today, it's probably shockingly shoddy in terms of where people actually are now. How many disasters have happened that way of sort of secrets and private information and so on that got out? Probably not too much, just because kind of the chances are the person who is dealing with that medical information or something, and in a not very secure location, if anybody looks over their shoulder, they don't really care about the medical data of person X. So the chances are, the world's a big enough place that the chances are nothing bad happens from that. But yes, it's an interesting thought. I mean, I suppose I don't know what level of security people would be happy with. I mean, I don't know. Back in the day, I certainly knew of people who were getting, secure phone lines installed in their houses and so on. I don't know if that's really a thing anymore with modern cryptography and so on. I mean, one certainly, it seems like a lot of the pretty consumer services are getting used sometimes more than they should, perhaps, by folks in, pretty secure professions. And I don't think that the idea of the special phone line being installed is probably much of a thing anymore. I mean, I think it's always a question of what, with all those kinds of things, what's the potential risk, and what, how much are people prepared to spend to avoid that kind of risk. Let's see, maybe one more question. I realize that I am suffering from not having eaten my lunch today, so I may not be as coherent as I sometimes am. Well, let's see. Des is asking, what are some new words you've learned recently that you think are cool? Des says, I keep on telling non-native speakers that the process of learning English is something that never ends, but they don't believe it. Well, as somebody who moved from the UK to the US, what is it now? 47 years ago, I can say that I am shocked by the fact that I still learn new American words even today. I probably would learn new British words if I lived in England as well. But there are things where there's some domain of endeavor where it's kind of like one just wasn't exposed to it. And so there's some new word that one learns. I was meaning to go back and do a study because I capture all of the things that I type and have done for, well, certainly for things like email for 35 years. And I was planning to go back and do a study of when did I first use all sorts of different words. I did do that study years ago, but when did I first use the names of Wolfram language functions? But But in terms of things I've learned, well, I was trying to invent a word actually a couple of days ago. Um, I might post about it. Um, I was um, uh, I was using an LLM because I was thinking, I wonder how good the LLMs have got at doing mathy kinds of things, and I keep on tracking that. And I mean, we are supplying the kind of the tool that LLMs can call to be able to do things like math really well. But the question is, how good do the LLMs get sort of on their own account at doing those sorts of things? And so I was looking, asked some math question and of a reasoning model, and it sat there for 10 minutes and it ground away, and eventually it produced this paper length kind of description of the thing. And I looked through it, and it's very convincing at some level, except at the end it got obviously the wrong answer. So then I say, well, this is obviously the wrong answer because whatever, and it says, oh, I'm terribly sorry, all the usual stuff. And then it goes and produces another long paper length thing, which also produces something which seems like, well, it's a little bit more plausible. So I said, can you give me some references for this? And so it trots out a bunch of references. And actually, the very first one it trotted out was something which I more or less recognize. I know the author that it attributed it to. And it's like, okay, that's somewhat convincing. This is presumably coming from a search and so on. And then I was sufficiently convinced that I kind of sent off this batch of references to a person who does this for me. And I said, can you go get me copies of these things? And then I thought, let me actually check. I'm just curious. Maybe I can just find this myself. So I start looking, and it's like, that's not found on the web. And then I thought I'd ask it, because it's a problem. I'd asked it a problem that I've actually worked on a bit myself. I'd asked it, have I, just by name, so to speak, written about this? And so it says, oh yes, yes, Stephen Wolfram wrote about this stuff, and it gives, wrote about it in a book, New Kind of Science, and it says, on page 847 of that book, the third paragraph, blah 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 blah, and and then I'm like, well, that's somewhat plausible. I didn't think I'd specifically written about it there. If I did, I feel a bit embarrassed because I've written about this more recently, and I must have forgotten that I wrote about it in the NKS book. So I thought, okay, that's really easy for me to check. I just go to that page of the book, and oh my gosh, it's not there. And so I want a word for what it means to be. It's not fished. It's not. But it felt the same way. I felt kind of stupid because it was like I was taken in. I thought this LLM was actually producing stuff that made any sense. It wasn't. It was just, the texture was right. The content was just complete nonsense. Um, and so I was trying to come up with a word. So the immediate word that I came up was with is LLMped, as in it's kind of a version of duped, but it relates to an LLM. So that was my word for yesterday, which we'll see whether it's. I think I need a word for that because as you start seeing these things where people say, "Look, the LLM is doing all this amazing reasoning; it's going to figure out all of science and so on," and how much are you getting LLM'd as you look at those kinds of things? I will say that when I tried the same question with our notebook assistant technology, which uses LLMs and also uses computational augmented generation and our computational tools, it was much more modest in what it claimed. But what it claimed was his piece of code that you can run to investigate this. And that piece of code was just fine and it ran fine. And it was a reasonable way to be off and running and solving this problem. It wasn't saying, very confidently, I have it, I've solved it all. Here's the paper that proves it. And just getting one to be LLM that way, so to speak. So that's a thought about that was my new word for yesterday. In terms of I mean, another source, of course, of new words is the young, who always seem to know about new words before the old fogies know about it. And I always wonder a little bit, how can the kids, what is it about communication between kids that causes them to learn new words before the old fogies learn new words, even if the old fogies are in kind of energetic meetings with people where lots of kinds of things are discussed. that remains a bit of a mystery for me. I mean, I think perhaps uh, it's also perhaps when people start using a new word and other people in the conversation have no idea what that word actually means, and they kind of deduce it from context, maybe kids are more prepared and perhaps even more able to do that than the old fogies, so to speak. But just a few thoughts. I'm trying to remember what other new words I've learnt very recently. And gosh, what have I been doing recently? Um, yeah, I learned a bunch of new words because I've been thinking a bit about neuroscience, and I learned a bunch of new words associated with brains that I didn't know before, or more to the point, they were words that I'd sort of vaguely heard, but I didn't really know what they meant. And it's very confusing in neuroscience because things will be called this or that, and it'll be like I don't know, the basal ganglia is neither at the base of the brain nor is it a ganglion, but it's called the basal ganglia. And it's like, well, why is that? Well, it has some historical story behind it. And I think that's a thing, neuroscience, or at least anatomy, is an old field full of all kinds of sort of historically derived nomenclature, some of which is, we now know that the original reason it was called that is complete nonsense, but we're not going to rename it. And so it gets stuck with that name, and that just becomes a weird thing you have to learn that you can't kind of deduce from anything else. The Davey comments about my question about kids, maybe because they want to invent and accept new words. Old guys don't like change. You might be right. I mean, I think that it is it is always an interesting thing. There's kind of a last comment here, but it's always an interesting thing when new things come on the scene, the extent to which they're taken up by the young versus the old, so to speak. And I think there's some kinds of activities where, it's like there are things that are sort of made for the teenagers type thing, and they're going to be the people who take them on, and the old fogies are just not going to be into that particular kind of sort of new kind of weird gaming thing, or new weird kind of social media thing. But when it comes to more intellectual things, I've always been interested by the fact that it is not always the young that take on new intellectual directions. I remember a long time ago, 1990, I think it was, we had our first Mathematica user conference. And in those days, before the web had taken off and so on, all we knew about the people who'd registered to come to this conference was their names. And so it was a curious thing because this was sort of a new thing, a new area. It was a curious thing. How many of these people are going to be young and how many of them are going to be old? And we were kind of standing around. I remember waiting for that conference to start, literally waiting for the attendees to show up. And it's like, who were these people going to be? And, were they all going to be young? No. It was kind of a uniform distribution of ages. And what we saw there, and I've seen it in a bunch of other sort of areas where I've kind of been involved in introducing new things, or been at the as a spectator of new things being introduced, is that there are people where sort of a thing arrives at a certain time in their life and they've been doing other things, but the thing that arrives is of sort of perfect resonance with the things that they're interested in. And then they might be 50 years old or whatever else it is, but then it's like, okay, I'm in a position where I can sort of take the risk to study this new thing. I'm just going to go do it. And they take off like crazy in that direction. And sometimes the young are actually not even in, and particularly in modern times and intellectual kinds of areas, the young are often not in positions where they are as able to sort of take an intellectual risk. They're like, well, I have to make my advisor happy, and so I have to do this specific thing. I can't just go off and start studying this other random thing. And so I think it's a when it comes to intellectual ideas, it's it's surprising the extent to which, at least in my experience, the old, not everybody, there are plenty of people who are like, I'm doing my thing, I'm never going to change. It's more the people where it's kind of like, I've got a thing, but there's this new thing that really resonates with what I'm fundamentally resonates with me, that they can go off and explore. Another thing that I've been surprised by is when I go give talks and things like at universities and such like, and it's kind of like who's coming to these things, and it is surprising the extent to which, well, maybe I actually don't know in recent times because I haven't done as many in person of these things as I might have done. But back 20 years ago, I was a little bit shocked by the amount of gray hair, so to speak, in the audience for things that are kind of out at the leading edge. And it's um, so I'm not the old are not are by no means there certainly are people who are locked in one direction and that's all they're going to go in, but I don't think it's a necessary feature, so to speak. All right, I got to go to my day job, but thanks for joining me and thanks for lots of interesting questions, and I look forward to talking to you all again another time. Bye for now.